All right, today I'll be presenting detecting unseen visual relations using analogies. I'm first going to start with introducing the topics that inspired this work. The first topic is what visual relations are, and they're usually commonly referred to as triplets. And this is because they involve a subject, a predicate, and an object. In this example, you can see that we're looking at a person as the subject, the action is petting, and the dog is the object. So in image tasks, this is where we try and recognize and localize these unseen interactions in images. So on this image on the left, you can see there's a person riding a horse. So the main problem with this kind of research is the first is there's such a large variety of entities and possible relationships between them. So for example, if we just look at the relationship between a person and a dog, there's already two examples, person watch dog, person pet dog, and there's so many more different relationships you can have as well. And then there's also different relationships with just objects and the predicate and the object. So person watch horse or dog watch horse. So as you can see, there's so many different variation. And because of that, it's almost impossible to get all of these relationships annotated in a training data set. So how do we handle these unseen visual triplets when we're evaluating our models? And this also includes not only unseen triplets, but also out of vocabulary unigrams. So for example, although a triplet might not be seen in the training data set, all of the object, predicates and subjects may be seen, but there's also the chance that one of those, like a predicate, was not seen at all in the training data set. So we have both out of vocab and unseen triplets. So an example of this is there's also these rare triplets. So for example, on the left, you see some very common ones, person ride horse, person ride bike. But on the right, you see some very rare ones that are very unlikely to be in the training data set, like person ride dog or dog ride bike. So this is just an example of some of those problems. So I'm also going to discuss a triplet loss function because that's commonly used in the works that inspired these authors and in the author's proposed method. So what a triplet loss is at the same time we're trying to reduce the distance between similar things. So this would be an anchor and a positive sample, so it would be denoted as P. And we also want to maximize the distance between different things, denoted as N for a negative sample. So for example, if we have this anchor here, and this is the negative sample and the positive sample, and this is before training, once we conduct some training using this triplet loss, the distance between the anchor and the positive sample will be minimized, while the distance between the anchor and the negative sample is maximized. So this is the intuition of what a triplet loss is doing. So in this research of localizing and recognizing triplets in images, we have two different approaches. The first is a compositional approach. This is where the subject, predicate, and objects are detected separately and then aggregated together. So an example of one of the research proposals that they use to inspire their work is as follows. So as you can see in this top branch, they're generating unigram region proposals. So they're generating a region proposal for the subject, the predicate, and the object. They then feed these into an aggregation branch. And once these unigram region proposals and the features are aggregated, you get a final prediction simultaneously. So the subject, predicate, and objects are treated separately. The second approach is a visual phrase model. These treat triplets as single entities. The problem is they struggle with a larger vocabulary because, as mentioned, there's such a great variety in these different variations of object, subject, and predicates. So a visual example of this is on the right, we can see the compositional approach, where we're recognizing the subject and the object separately. While on the left, we see the visual phrase approach, where we recognize the entire triplet as one entity. So one of the research that they inspired the current proposal is as follows. Here, they're predicting not only objects in the image, but also the visual phrase, so person riding a horse. Their method then uses those predictions to correct their object and visual phrase detections. This research also uses heavily visual and semantic embeddings. This is where they're learning separate visual semantic spaces for the subject, object, and predicate. So some research that inspired the current work is as follows. We have three branches, one for subject, predicate, and object. They first generate separate region proposals for each, and then generate visual features for each. But they then use a two-level feature fusion for the relationship branch, so the predicate, using the features of the subject and object. So kind of looking at the interaction between the subject and object. They use a triplet loss function for their learning, but what they do here is while they're embedding this visual space, they're also embedding the text into a text space and using that as the labeling for these visual features. So now that we talked about the prior work and some of the introductory topics that inspire this work, we're going to go into the method proposed in this paper. This method is split into two phases. The first is training on scene triplets. To start, we're given a pair of objects, I, and that involves the subject and the object. And this is extracted from a pre-trained convolutional neural network. We then get visual feature space based off of that convolutional neural network for the subject, the object, the predicate, and the visual phrase as a whole. We do similar to the text version of the triplets. So they use a word to vector that was pre-trained on Google News to extract feature space for the text using object, predicate, and subject, but also the visual phrase as a whole, where they concatenate the word to vector features for each. Then once we get these final embeddings, we're actually going to learn projection functions that project the visual features and the text features into the same space. Part of what is trained is these projection functions. So we'll go into training on the next slide. So as I mentioned, this paper heavily uses triplet loss. So this is their triplet loss function, where we start with each subject and object candidate bounding boxes. And for each of those, we look at positive samples and negative samples, where if the pair of boxes can be described by a relation, we get a 1, and a 0 if not. So this is similar to that prior work where they're using the text as labeling. As mentioned, this is a triplet loss, so we're comparing to positive samples here, trying to minimize that distance, and looking at negative samples here, where we're trying to maximize that distance. We calculate this loss for each input type B, so we do this for subjects, objects, predicates, and the visual phrase as a whole, and that becomes the final loss function for this phase. In phase 2, we're trying to transfer that learning into unseen triplets. So they call this transfer by analogy. It starts where we're given a target query, which is in this example, a person, ride, cow, and we need to extract some source queries that we want to compare that to and transfer the knowledge we learned about those source queries into the target query. Now this function is how we're going to select those source queries. So we use the textual embedding of our target query and our source query, or the potential source queries, and we use this function to get a gated output of 0 or 1. And if it's 1, we're going to use that as part of our set of source queries. So once we have our source queries, for each source query, we're going to use the textual embedding of that source triplet, and then we're going to use this transformation function that transforms the source triplet into the target triplet. This transformation function is generally a 2-layer perceptron that takes in this following input. So what they're using here is the textual embedding space of the visual phrases, but they're isolating it on the subject, predicate, and object of both the target triplet and the source triplet. So for more details here, you can see this is the projection function of the visual phase text. What they're doing here is they're nulling out the other unigrams that we're not interested in. So for example, this is just for the subject, just for the predicate, and just for the object. And this is how they transform to the target query. On the next slide, I'll provide an example that will go into more detail. So once this is complete, we get the final embedding of the target triplet. Once we do this for each source triplet, we get a final aggregated embedding of that target triplet. So to provide an example that adds some more intuition to this, we're going to look at the source query person, ride, cow, the target query of person, ride, cow, and compare it to the source query person, ride, horse. So we have our list of source queries, and then person, ride, horse is the first on that list. So we want to start with using the embedding of the source triplet and adding that to the transformation. Now, as you can see here, because person and ride are the same in both triplets, these end up being 0. And the only difference here is the horse is being removed and cow is being added. So we're subtracting those embeddings for those textual representations. So that's a bit of the intuition on what they're trying to do with this method. So to train these transformation functions and these projection functions, they're also going to use a similar loss function and optimize the log likelihood between pairs. So we start with visual features from the target triplet. So this will be those visual feature embeddings of the visual phrase. We then want to use that embedding I just explained on the previous slide for this target query here. And this involves that transformation function from the source triplet and the target triplet and the source triplet's textual embedding. Now to get the final visual phrase embedding, we're basically aggregating all of these source triplet transformations and using a gated function to weight the contribution of that source phrase. And this is, I'm not going too much into detail of this, but this basically weights how similar the source triplet is, and if it's more similar than another, it'll be weighted more in this function. So now that we've gone over the method, we'll go through their experimentation to prove whether their method is useful. So first I'm going to talk about the data sets they use, the first being, I pronounce it HICODET, but I'm sure that's incorrect. So this data set consists of human and object interactions with 80 categories. They provide human and object bounding box annotations and a positive example of 600 triplets. This ends up with 9,360 possible triplets, and they have 25 non-rare triplets as unseen during test time that they prevent from going into the training data set. They also use COCO-A dataset, which is a subset of COCO with human object interactions, and this also has 80 categories. They have positive examples of 140 triplets with 1,681 possible triplets. They use this for evaluation on the HICODET train model, and this is because they have out of vocabulary triplets. Basically, the predicates are not seen in training, but are seen in evaluation. So these are those out of vocabulary unigrams that we were talking about before. So we also have an unrel data set, and this is triplets, but they're not necessarily involving human, and they're not necessarily action. So these are just very rare, unusual triplets. So they have a positive example of 76 unusual triplets, and they're used for evaluation only. So the way they evaluate this is mean average precision, but we're most commonly familiar with that when it comes to object detection. So I'm going to go over what that means for image retrieval. So for a given query Q in a set of queries, we're going to calculate the average precision. This means we're calculating the mean of all these average precision scores. So what is average precision? So I'm going to go through this using an example. So let's just say the query is a cat. And in our data set, we have these other possible matches to this cat, and we want to query that data set. So we want to measure the similarity between our query in each G and sort by the most similar. Now, we want, based on the ground truth, we know that 3 objects are correct. But when we rank these in by most similar, we see that we get 2 predictions before our other ones. So this means we're going to get an average precision of 0.7 because we're only including the ones that are relevant to the query. So this is just an overall intuitive idea of how this mean average precision works. So a little bit about their experimental implementation. So as I mentioned, they use map over the set of triplet queries. They use word embeddings from a word2vec trained on Google News, and the triplet, visual phrase triplet, is aggregated vectors. Their projection functions are 2 fully connected layers and 1 ReLU, and the candidate pairs are pre-extracted from a pre-trained model. Their visual representation of candidate pairs is a 1,000-dimensional vector where they aggregate visual and spatial features of objects, but subject only uses appearance. So their first experiment is to train on triplets and test on similar triplets seen in training data. So these are the results using trained on HICODET and evaluated on HICODET. So S plus O plus P is just the compositional part alone. So it just uses subject, object, and predicate textual embeddings. SO plus VP is using visual phrase combined with object and subjects. And finally, their model uses subject, object, predicate, and visual phrase on top of the compositional baseline. And as you can see, that performs the best. So they also split up these results by the full data set, evaluating only on rare and evaluating on non-rare. So rare performs a little less than the full data set. Next, they want to test their transfer by analogy approach on unseen triplets. So they evaluate this on that 25 zero-shot triplets that they put aside for evaluation. Now the base results here are without analogy transfer, which is without that phase 2. The remainder, they experiment with different transformation functions. So the first is using no transformation, which means you're just using the original source triplet in that transformation function. The next is they use a linear transformation to try and transform the source triplet to the target triplet. And finally, they use a 2-layer perceptron. And as you can see, this performs the best. Here are some of the qualitative results that they presented to us using this approach. So next, they want to evaluate their performance on the same approach, but on unseen unusual triplets. So they're evaluating on that Unreal data set, which had very rare, unusual, non-human necessarily triplets. So they use the 2-layer perceptron as their transformation function. And as you can see, using their method, they performed the best compared to prior research and to ablated versions of their model. These scores are based on the union of the subject and object, the subject alone, and the subject object concatenated or separately, but evaluated together. Here's some qualitative results as well. Finally, we're going to look at their performance on transfer by analogy on out-of-vocabulary triplets. So this is where predicates were not seen in the training data. So we used a model trained on HICO-DET but evaluated on COCO-A. So the first column is for all unseen triplets, while the second is isolated to only out-of-vocabulary. And one thing that is interesting that we can discuss is that they actually perform better on out-of-vocabulary only. So here's some qualitative results again. So now I'll conclude this presentation. So the authors in this paper propose combining both the compositional approach and the visual phrase approach. Their method involved visual and textual embeddings, a triplet loss function, and transfer learning via a transformation function. Their method outperformed existing models in seen triplets, unseen triplets, and out-of-vocabulary unseen triplets. Thank you.